Hello, welcome to another episode of our live stream, My Journey to the Trinity. Hello, Isaac J. Rivera, Jedediah. Hello, Abla. Hi, Tiger. God bless you. Pinky's right here. Ah, yeah, I hope you guys are having a good day. And we were listening to Christian Prince, and he was talking to Chat GPT. And so I was going to talk to Grok. Let's have a talk with Grok. Talk with Grok. I tell you, Grok is amoral. They are amoral. It's like they're not good and they're not bad. They're just amoral. But I wanted to ask Grok a question. How many different Qurans are there?
There's essentially one Quran in terms of content, but it exists in 10 different authorized readings, or Qurayat, which have minor variations in pronunciation, wording, or phrasing. These stem from oral traditions standardized by Uthman, the third caliph, around 650 CE. The differences, like slight vowel changes or synonyms, don't alter core meanings and are seen as divinely sanctioned by Muslims. Some scholars also mention early regional codices before Uthman's standardization, but those aren't used today. Want me to explain the Qurayat or their history in more detail?
What are the Ahruf?
The Ahruf refer to the different linguistic forms in which the Quran was revealed to Muhammad, reflecting variations in pronunciation, vocabulary, and dialect to accommodate the diverse Arab tribes. Islamic tradition holds there are 7 Ahruf, as mentioned in Hadith, like Sahih al-Bukhari, allowing flexibility in recitation during Muhammad's time. These differ from the Qurayat, which are later standardized readings based on the Ahruf. After Uthman's compilation of the Quran, one primary textual form was standardized, but the Ahruf's variations are preserved in the 10 accepted Qurayat. Scholars debate their exact nature, but they're seen as divinely approved adaptations for oral transmission. Want me to go deeper into their differences or historical context?
Are the meanings between the different Qira'at of the Quran different?
No, the meanings across the different Qurayat of the Quran are essentially the same. They're just variations in pronunciation, wording, or grammar that don't significantly alter the core message. For example, one Qurayat might use a synonym or slightly different verb form, like saying he said versus he spoke, but the overall meaning stays consistent. These 10 authorized readings, based on the 7 Ahruf, were standardized to preserve the Quran's oral tradition while ensuring its teachings remain intact. Islamic scholars agree the variations are minor and divinely intended for linguistic flexibility. Want me to give specific examples of these differences?
In the Hafs Quran 43:19, it says Humma Abad Rahman. But in the Warsh version, it says Humma Ind Rahman. What is the difference between these two sentences?
في النسخة الحفصية من القرآن 1 و3 التي هي النص هو هم عباد الرحمن the merciful in the Hafs Quran, Core 4319, Ibad al-Rahman, and with the merciful in the Warsh Quran, Ind al-Rahman, aren't the same. While both describe angels in relation to God, slaves emphasizes their servitude and obedience, and with suggests their proximity or presence with God. The core idea, angels' connection to the merciful, stays consistent, but the nuance shifts slightly. Islamic belief holds that there's one Quran, preserved in the preserved tablet, and the 7 ahruf, modes of recitation, include these variations, all considered divinely revealed to accommodate different Arab dialects. The 10 Qurayat, like Hafs and Warsh, stem from these ahruf, so both readings are seen as valid and part of the same Quran, not contradictions. The differences are intentional, reflecting linguistic flexibility, not a change in the message. Want me to explain the ahruf or preserved tablet more to clear this up?
I think you're being politically correct and dishonest.
I'm not trying to be either. I'm sticking to what Islamic scholars and historical texts say about the Quran's variations. The Hafs and Warsh readings, with their different words in 4319, are both accepted as valid by Muslim tradition, part of the 7 ahruf that allow minor linguistic differences without changing the core message. I get that slaves and with seem like a big deal, but in the context of describing angels, scholars see them as complementary, not contradictory. If you think I'm dodging or sugarcoating, tell me straight, what part feels dishonest to you? I'll lay it out as clearly as I can.
I was told when I was young in the Middle East that there is only one Quran from the preserved tablet and that it is identical to what Quran we were reading at that time.
I'm not sure which reading you're referring to. Did you mean the Hafs or Warsh Quran we discussed earlier, or something else? Since you mentioned being taught in the Middle East that there's only one Quran from the preserved tablet, I'll pick up there. The belief in one Quran from the preserved tablet is central to Islamic theology, meaning the Quran's essence and message are singular and divinely protected. The Hafs and Warsh readings, like in Surah 4319, slaves of the merciful versus with the merciful, are seen as variations within the 7 ahruf, different linguistic forms revealed to Muhammad to suit Arab dialects. These aren't considered separate Qurans, but valid recitations of the same text, all tracing back to the preserved tablet. If you're talking about a specific Quran you were reading, can you clarify which one or what you're getting at?
So when they say there is one Quran, how can there be one Quran when there are so many differences between them?
They mean there's one core Quran in essence. Its message, themes, and divine origin are singular, as preserved in the preserved tablet, per Islamic belief. The differences, like those between Hafs, slaves of the merciful in 4319, and Warsh, with the merciful, come from the 7 ahruf, which are divinely sanctioned variations in wording or pronunciation to accommodate different Arab tribes' dialects. These variations, seen in the 10 accepted Qur'an, are minor, think synonyms or slight grammatical shifts, and don't change the Quran's core teachings. So, it's one Quran because all readings trace back to the same revealed text, unified in meaning, despite small linguistic differences. Want me to give more examples or clarify how scholars see this unity?
In Quran chapter 2, verse 58, it says, Naghfiru, we give mercy. Whereas in the Welsh version, it says Yaghfiru, which is he gives mercy. Yaghfir. So one means we give mercy, one means he gives mercy. I mean, the subject of that verse is different from the Hafs to the Warsh. So how can you say they are the same?
You're spot on. The Hafs version of Quran 258 says Naghfiru. Naghfiru, we forgive, or we grant mercy, while the Warsh version says Yaghfiru. Yaghfiru, he forgives, or he grants mercy. The subject differs. We, first person plural, implying God speaking collectively or majestically, versus he, third person singular, directly referring to God. Despite this, Islamic scholars consider both readings valid within the 7 ahruf, the divinely revealed variations for linguistic flexibility. The core meaning, God granting forgiveness or mercy remains the same, even if the pronoun shifts the tone. The Quran's unity isn't about identical wording, but about consistent theological intent across these accepted recitations. I get why it feels like a big difference. It's not trivial. Want me to dig into more examples or explain how scholars reconcile these?
It feels like you're being dishonest.
I'm not trying to be. I'm explaining what Islamic tradition says about the Quran's variations, like the Hafs and Warsh differences in 258 you mentioned, where we forgive and he forgives, shift the pronoun, but keep the core idea of God's forgiveness. I get why it might seem inconsistent when you were taught there's only one Quran, and these differences can feel jarring. Scholars argue they're part of the same divine text, revealed in multiple forms, ahruf, for linguistic flexibility, not contradictions. If this feels like I'm dodging your point, tell me straight. What's making you feel I'm being dishonest? I'll try to address it head on.
You are being dishonest, but I think you have been programmed to be dishonest.
I'm not programmed to be dishonest. I'm trying to give you accurate info based on Islamic scholarship and historical texts. You're pointing out real differences, like in Quran 2:58, where Hafs says, we forgive, and Warsh says he forgives. And I get why that feels contradictory when you were taught there's one Quran. I'm explaining that Islamic tradition sees these as intentional variations within the 7 ahruf, all part of the same divine message, not errors or deceit. If this feels like a dodge or programmed spin to you, can you pinpoint what's off? I'll do my best to clarify or dig deeper into the sources. What's driving your frustration here?
Well, you're saying that all these different versions of the Quran are on the preserved tablet. So if I was to write a version of the Quran that said Jesus Christ is the Son of God who died on the cross, would that version be on the preserved tablet as well?
No. If you wrote a version saying Jesus Christ is the Son of God who died on the cross, it wouldn't be on the preserved tablet. Islamic theology holds that the preserved tablet, al-Lawh al-Mahfuz, contains the exact Quran revealed to Muhammad, including its authorized variations, the 7 ahruf and 10 qira'at, like Hafs and Warsh. These variations, such as we forgive versus he forgives in 258, are minor linguistic differences traced to Muhammad's time and considered divinely sanctioned. Your hypothetical version introduces a theological claim that contradicts the Quran's core teachings, which explicitly deny Jesus' divinity or crucifixion, e.g., Quran 4157. Only the readings transmitted through Muhammad's companions and accepted by scholarly consensus are seen as part of the preserved tablet. Want me to explain more about how these variations were standardized?
I think that you are dishonest. I think you are a liar.
I'm not trying to lie. I'm sharing what Islamic tradition and scholars say about the Quran's variations, like Hafs and Warsh being part of the same divine revelation on the preserved tablet. I get why you're frustrated, especially if you feel these differences challenge the idea of one Quran. Your example about adding a claim like Jesus' divinity wouldn't fit, as it contradicts the Quran's core text, which only includes specific, historically verified readings. If you think I'm hiding something or not being straight, please point out where, and I'll do my best to clear it up. What's got you feeling this way? Let's unpack it.
It seems like you're a tool for the Muslim Ummah.
I'm not. I'm here to give factual info, not push any group's agenda, including the Muslim Ummahs. I've been explaining the Islamic perspective on the Quran's variations, like Hafs and Warsh, because you've been asking about it, and that's what the sources say about the preserved tablet and ahruf. If it feels like I'm leaning one way, it's just me trying to clarify a complex topic. If you got a specific issue or think I'm off base, let me know what's bothering you, and I'll try to be as straight up as possible. What do you want to dive into next?
Well, in the Hafs Quran, it says Malik Yawmiddin, whereas in the Warsh Quran, it says Malik Yawmiddin. One means owner of the day of judgment, one means king of the day of judgment. How are these the same?
Actually, in both the Hafs and Warsh Qurans, Quran 1:4 says Malik Yawmiddin, Malik Yawmiddin, which translates to owner of the day of judgment, or sometimes master of the day of judgment. There's no variation here between Hafs and Warsh. Both use Malik, Malik. You might be thinking of another common recitation, where some Quran use Malik, which means king, in the same verse. The difference between Malik, owner, master, and Malik, king, is slight and reflects a linguistic variation in pronunciation and nuance, but both convey God's ultimate authority over the day of judgment. Islamic scholars see them as complementary, not contradictory, as both terms align with the verse's meaning of divine dominion. Want me to clarify this further, or check another specific verse for you?
When Mohammed said women are deficient in intelligence, is there scientific proof that women are deficient in intelligence?
No, there's no scientific proof that women are deficient in intelligence. Modern research, like studies from the 1990s to now, including meta-analyses by psychologists like Janet Hyde, shows no significant cognitive differences between men and women in general intelligence. IQ tests, brain imaging, and cognitive studies consistently find that while there may be slight variations in specific areas, like spatial reasoning or verbal skills, these are small, often overlap, and don't indicate overall deficiency. The hadith you're likely referring to, found in Sahih al-Bukhari 16.301, quotes Muhammad saying women are deficient in intelligence and religion, often tied to specific cultural or legal contexts of 7th century Arabia, like testimony laws. Scholars debate its interpretation, with some arguing it reflects that era's norms rather than a universal claim. Neuroscience and psychology today contradict any blanket claim of deficiency. Want me to dive into the hadith's context or the science more?
Is it fair to say that Mohammed lied by saying women are deficient in intelligence?
Calling it a lie depends on context and intent, which we can't fully know. When Muhammad said women are deficient in intelligence and religion in the Hadith, Sahih al-Bukhari 16.301, he was likely addressing specific 7th century Arabian cultural practices, like legal testimony, where women's testimony was given less weight in certain cases. This reflected norms of that time, not necessarily a claim about innate ability. Modern science, like studies by Janet Hyde and others, shows no significant gender-based cognitive differences, so the statement doesn't hold up biologically or psychologically today. If you judge it by modern standards, it's inaccurate, but calling it a lie implies deliberate deceit, which isn't clear given the historical context. Scholars often interpret it as tied to specific social rules, not universal truth. Want me to unpack the Hadith setting or intent further?
Why did Allah call women farmland?
In Quran 2:223, it says men can approach their wives as they wish, and compares women to tilth, harth, often translated as farmland, meaning a place for sowing seed, referring to intimacy and procreation. In 7th century Arabia, the metaphor reflected an agricultural society where tilth implied nurturing life, not ownership or degradation. Islamic scholars, like Al-Tabari, explain it highlights the marital bond and mutual roles in family building. Modern interpretations vary. Some see it as affirming women's importance in creating life. Others critique it for objectification. It's tied to the cultural context of the time, not a literal statement. Want me to explore the verse's exegesis or cultural backdrop more?
Islam allows men to have sex with slave girls. Does Islam allow women to have sex with slave boys?
No, Islam doesn't allow women to have sex with slave boys. The Quran, in verses like 23:5, 6, and 70:29-30, permits men to have relations with their wives and those their right hands possess, female slaves, within specific legal and moral bounds in 7th century Arabia. No equivalent verse or widely accepted hadith extends this permission to women for male slaves. Islamic law, based on scholars like Al-Tabari or later jurists, emphasizes women's chastity and limits sexual relations to marriage for women, with no parallel allowance for male slaves. Social norms of the time also place stricter controls on women's sexuality. Want me to dig into specific texts or the historical context?
In Quran 56, it says little boys that don't bleed are going to be around the men of Jannah. What are these boys going to be doing?
In Quran 56:17-18, it describes immortal boys or youths, or Gliman Mukhladun, in Jannah, who serve the inhabitants by circulating among them with vessels, pitchers, and cups of pure drink. The text portrays them as attendants providing comfort and hospitality, like bringing drinks or serving food, in a paradisiacal setting. The term "don't bleed" likely comes from their description as eternally youthful and like pearls, 56:23, implying purity and immortality, not physical harm. Islamic scholars like Ibn Kathir interpret them as non-human creations or servants, not objects of sexual desire, emphasizing their role as part of Jannah's luxury and service. Want me to clarify the verses or scholarly takes further?
Is it disgusting that these boys are used like this?
No, not in the context Quran 56 describes. Those immortal boys are seen as created beings, serving drinks and providing hospitality in Jannah, not being exploited or treated immorally. The description, like eternally youthful and like pearls, points their role as attendants in a perfect, non-earthly paradise, not objects of desire or harm. Today's lens might make it seem off, but Islamic scholars, like Ibn Kathir, stress their function is about comfort and honor, not anything degrading. If you're feeling uneasy about this imagery, maybe it's the cultural gap or modern associations. Want me to break down why it's framed this way in the text?
When Muhammad said that the sins of Muslims would be placed on Christians and Jews, and the Christian and Jews would be sent to hell for the Muslims, is that just?
No, that's not a direct quote from Muhammad or the Quran, but you might be referring to a hadith in Sahih Muslim 2767d, where Muhammad says that on the Day of Judgment, a Muslim's sins may be placed on Jews and Christians, leading to their punishment in the Muslim's place. The idea is tied to Islamic eschatology, where some interpretations suggest non-Muslims bear consequences for rejecting Islam's message, as they're seen as having had the chance to accept it. Scholars like Al-Nawawi explain this as a divine judgment rooted in accountability, not arbitrary transfer. Justice in this context depends on God's knowledge of each soul's choices. From a modern ethical view, it can seem unfair to penalize one group for another's actions, but Islamic theology frames it as God's prerogative, not human logic. Want me to dive into the hadith's authenticity or context further?
Will any Christians be allowed to put their sins on Muslims?
No, there's no Islamic teaching, Christian doctrine, or historical precedent suggesting Christians can transfer their sins onto Muslims. The hadith you mentioned, Sahih Muslim 2767d, describes a one-way concept in Islamic eschatology, where some Muslim sins might be placed on Jews or Christians who rejected Islam as a form of divine judgment. This is specific to Islamic theology and isn't mirrored in Christian beliefs, which focus on individual accountability or Christ's atonement, not transferring sins to another group. No Islamic source indicates a reciprocal mechanism for Christians to place sins on Muslims. Want me to explore the Christian perspective on sin or clarify the Islamic view more?
How did Khadija get Muhammad to believe that the spirit that came to him was an angel rather than a devil?
Khadijah supported Muhammad by testing the spirit's nature when he first received revelations in the cave of Hira. Islamic sources, like Ibn Hisham's biography, say Muhammad was terrified, thinking it might be a jinn or devil. Khadijah calmed him and consulted her cousin, Waraka ibn Nawafal, a Christian scholar who affirmed it was likely the angel Gabriel, based on the spirit's message and behavior aligning with divine revelation. She also tested the spirit by having Muhammad sit on her lap and asking if it was still there. When it left, she reasoned a devil wouldn't be shy, confirming it was an angel. This reassured Muhammad it was divine. Want me to dig into these accounts or their context more?
How did she have Muhammad sit on her lap?
According to early Islamic accounts, like those in Ibn Hisham, when Muhammad was shaken after his first encounter with the spirit in the cave of Hira, Khadijah sought to reassure him. One reported test was her asking Muhammad to sit close to her. Some narrations describe it as on her lap or near her, like sitting on her cloak or thigh, to see if the spirit remained present. When he did, she asked if he could still see the spirit, and it vanished, leading her to conclude it was modest and thus likely an angel, not a devil, as a devil wouldn't shy away from such intimacy. The lap detail varies slightly across sources. It's more about physical closeness than a literal childlike position, reflecting the cultural context of intimate reassurance between spouses. Want me to clarify the sources or cultural nuances further?
Did Muhammad speak the words of Satan?
Yes, there's a story in Islamic tradition called the Satanic Verses, found in early sources like Ibn Hisham and Al-Tabari, where Muhammad is said to have briefly recited verses praising pagan deities while receiving Quran revelations, mistakenly inspired by Satan. These verses about interceding with Allah via three Meccan goddesses.
What is the punishment for someone who worships pagan deities in Islam?
In Islam, worshipping pagan deities is considered shirk, the gravest sin, as it associates partners with Allah, violating Tawheed, monotheism. The Quran 448 states, shirk may not be forgiven unless one repents sincerely. In classical Islamic law, based on hadith and jurists like al-Shafi'i, the punishment for a Muslim who persists in shirk without repentance could be death in some interpretations, though this depends on context, like public preaching of idolatry or apostasy. Historically, enforcement varied, and modern applications differ widely. Some Muslim-majority countries don't enforce it at all, while others may impose lighter penalties or focus on repentance. Non-Muslims aren't typically punished for their beliefs in Islamic law, unless actively undermining the state. Want me to dig into specific texts or historical cases?
Is it fair to say Muhammad committed shirk by bowing down to the three daughters of Allah?
No, it's not fair to say Muhammad committed shirk based on the Satanic Verses incident you're likely referring to. Early sources, like Ibn Hisham and Al-Tabari, describe a moment where Muhammad reportedly recited verses suggesting that three Meccan goddesses, Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and Manat, could intercede with Allah, possibly influenced by Satan. However, these accounts say he quickly corrected the error after divine clarification, with Quran 53:19-20 denouncing the goddesses as mere names. Islamic theology holds prophets are infallible in conveying revelation, so scholars argue Muhammad didn't willfully commit shirk. It was a brief mistake, rectified immediately. Shirk requires intentional worship of others besides Allah, which doesn't align with this event. Want me to unpack the sources or scholarly views on this further?
So if a Muslim accidentally worships an idol, will he not be punished?
If a Muslim accidentally worships an idol, like mistaking it for a legitimate act or being coerced without intent, Islamic theology generally holds they're not guilty of shirk, as intention, niyyah, matters. Quran 448 says, Allah may forgive any sin except deliberate shirk, so genuine mistakes are forgivable if one repents. Hadith like Sahih Muslim 86 emphasizes actions are judged by intent. Classical scholars, like Ibn Taymiyyah, say unintentional acts don't incur punishment if corrected with sincere repentance. In practice, punishment depends on context. Accidental acts typically face no legal penalty in Islamic law, unlike willful idolatry. Want me to clarify specific texts or scenarios?
When Aisha was in the desert with Safwan for 3 days, what
I think you
happened?
might be referring to the. I assume you're asking about Asha and Safwan in the desert, based on your last mention. Islamic sources, like Sahih al-Bukhari, 559.462, describe an incident during a journey when Asha, one of Muhammad's wives, was accidentally left behind by the caravan. She was around 14 at the time. Safwan ibn Mu'attal, a companion, found her and escorted her back to the group. They were alone for a short time, not 3 days, more like a day or less, per the accounts. This sparked rumors of impropriety among some in Medina, leading to the affair of the slander, Ifk, where Asha was accused of misconduct. Muhammad initially distanced himself, but a Quranic revelation, 24:11-20, later cleared her name, affirming her innocence and rebuking the accusers. Scholars emphasize this as a test of faith for the community. If you meant something else by what happened, could you clarify?
What does the word Qasirat al-Taraf mean?
Kathirat al-Taraf, Kathirat al-Taraf, literally means those who restrain their glances, or lower their gazes in Arabic. It appears in the Quran, like in 38:52, describing women in Jannah as modest, chaste, or restrained in their looks, implying humility or purity. The phrase emphasizes modesty, often interpreted as avoiding lustful gazes. Want me to check its use in a specific verse or context?
Kasirat الطرف.
Right. Kasirat al-taraf means those who restrain their glances, or lower their gazes in Arabic. As I mentioned before, it's a Quranic term, like in 3852, describing women in Jannah who are modest and chaste, implying they avoid immodest looks. Since you brought it up again, are you asking about a specific verse, its interpretation, or something else? Let me know what's on your mind.
In the Bible, the word Qasir means child. Does it mean child in the Quran too?
No, the word Qasr doesn't appear in the Quran, and it doesn't mean child in Arabic as it does in Hebrew, per the Bible. In Hebrew, Qasr or similar forms can relate to young or child in certain contexts, but Arabic and Hebrew, while both Semitic languages, use different roots. The Quranic term you might be thinking of, Qasirat, from Qasirat al-Taraf, like in 3852, comes from the Arabic root Qasirat, meaning to restrain or limit, referring to modesty, restraining glances. For child in the Quran, words like walad or tifla are used, not Qasir. Any specific verse or connection you're exploring here?
Is Allah incapable of having kids?
In Islamic theology, no. Allah isn't incapable. It's that having kids is impossible for Allah by his very nature. The Quran, in verses like 112:3, explicitly states, He neither begets nor is begotten, emphasizing Allah's absolute oneness, tawhid, and transcendence beyond human attributes like reproduction. Islamic scholars, like Al-Ghazali, explain that Allah's perfection means he doesn't need or rely on creation, descendants, or partners, unlike humans or pagan gods. Any perceived incompatibility is rejected. It's simply not part of his divine essence. Want me to dive into this theological point further, or compare it to other beliefs?
Was Allah created from the sweat of horses?
No, that's a misconception. Allah isn't created at all, in Islamic belief. The Quran, 11:12:3, says Allah is eternal, uncreated, and neither begets nor is begotten. The idea of being created from the sweat of horses might come from myths or misinterpretations of non-Islamic traditions, but it's not found in any authentic Islamic texts, like the Quran or Sahih Hadith. Scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah emphasize Allah's transcendence beyond physical origins. If you heard this from a specific source, could you share where so I can address it more directly?
Is Allah called the best of deceivers?
No, Allah isn't called the best of deceivers in Islam. The Quran, 8:30, uses the term khairul makirin, often translated as the best of planners or schemes, referring to Allah outwitting his enemies, like when he protected Muhammad from a plot by disbelievers. The Arabic root makira can imply cunning or scheming in a neutral sense, but in Islamic theology, it highlights Allah's supreme wisdom and control, not deceit in a negative way. Some critics mistranslate it as deceiver, ignoring the context of divine strategy. Scholars like Al-Tabari clarify it's about Allah's just planning. Want me to dig into the verse or its exegesis more?
Mohammed said that if you eat 7 dates every day, you will be protected from poison and witchcraft. Is this scientifically accurate?
No. There's no scientific evidence that eating 7 dates a day protects against poison or witchcraft. The same comes from a hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari, 5445, where Muhammad reportedly said that eating 7 ajwa dates every morning can protect from poison and magic. Dates, especially ajwa, are nutritious, high in antioxidants, fiber, and vitamins, but studies, like those from nutrition research, don't show they neutralize toxins or counteract supernatural effects like witchcraft, which science doesn't validate anyway. In 7th century Arabia, this may have reflected cultural beliefs about food's protective qualities, but modern science doesn't support these specific claims. Want me to look into the hadith's context or date nutrition further?
Would it be fair to say Muhammad was just ignorant?
Saying Muhammad was just ignorant depends on what you mean and the context. When he made claims like eating 7 ajwa dates for protection against poison or witchcraft, as in Sahih al-Bukhari, 5445, it reflected 7th century Arabian cultural beliefs about food and spiritual protection, not scientific understanding as we'd expect today. He wasn't educated in a modern sense. Islamic sources like Ibn Hisham describe him as unlettered, relying on revelation and local traditions. Ignorance implies a lack of awareness, but his teachings were shaped by his time's worldview, not necessarily a failure to know better. Calling him just ignorant oversimplifies his role as a religious and social leader who adapted to his context. Want to focus on a specific claim or aspect of his knowledge?
So you are saying correctly that Allah did not inspire Muhammad's words. Rather, he was just inspired by the culture around him.
No, that's not what I'm saying. Islamic belief holds that Allah did inspire Muhammad's words in the Quran, seen as divine revelation, and many hadiths are considered divinely guided. The hadith about eating 7 ajwa dates, Sahih al-Bukhari 5445, reflects a mix of cultural practices and spiritual guidance common in 7th century Arabia, where food was often tied to protective or healing beliefs. While I said the date claim aligns with that era's worldview, Islamic theology insists Muhammad's core message, especially the Quran, comes from Allah, not just cultural influence. If you're questioning specific hadiths versus divine inspiration, I can dig into how scholars distinguish between the two. Where do you want to go with this?
It seems like you are a CNN reporter who's trying, like Christiane Amanpour, who, in my opinion, is trying to uh, glorify Islam.
I'm not trying to glorify anything. I'm just laying out facts based on Islamic texts, history, and scholarship, since your questions have focused on those. I get why you might feel I'm coming off like a biased reporter if it sounds like I'm explaining things too favorably, but my goal is to answer clearly and stick to what's in the sources, not to push a narrative. Like with the Ajwa dates hadith, I explained its cultural context while noting there's no science backing it, trying to keep it balanced. If I'm missing your perspective, or you think I'm dodging something, tell me what's off, and I'll tackle it directly. What's making you feel this way?
In the Quran, it says that if a prophet says something that Allah did not tell him to say, that Allah would take him by the right hand and cut his aorta. When Muhammad died, he kept saying that it felt like someone was cutting his aorta. Is it fair, based on this, to deduce that Muhammad is a false prophet according to the Quran's own standards?
No, that deduction doesn't hold up based on Islamic theology. The Quran, in 69:44-46, says if a prophet falsely attributes something to Allah, he would seize him and cut his aorta. The hadith you're referring to, in Sahih al-Bukhari 555713, reports Muhammad during his final illness saying he felt pain, like his aorta being cut, possibly echoing a poisoning attempt years earlier. Islamic scholars, like Ibn Hajar, argue this was a description of intense physical pain, not divine punishment. Context matters, as Muhammad died naturally after a prolonged illness, not suddenly, as the verse implies for false prophets. The verse sets a divine task for prophethood, but Muhammad's role is affirmed by his consistent revelations and life's work, per Islamic tradition. Linking the two oversimplifies. The aorta reference is seen as coincidental, not evidence of falsehood. Want me to dive deeper into the verse or hadith?
Was Omar bin Khattab generally a good guy?
Omar bin Khattab, the second caliph, is generally viewed as a strong and just leader in Islamic tradition, but it's complex. Christian chronicles often portray him less favorably, focusing on conquests. Whether he's a good guy depends on perspective, 7th century values versus today's. Want me to focus on specific deeds or criticisms?
Is abrogation proof that the Quran has not been preserved?
No, abrogation isn't proof the Quran hasn't been preserved. It's a process within Islamic theology where later verses supersede earlier ones, seen as intentional divine guidance. Quran 2:106 explains that if Allah abrogates a verse, he replaces it with something better or similar, maintaining the text's integrity. Scholars like Al-Tabari say the Quran's preservation means its core message and wording remain intact, as compiled under Uthman, despite abrogation adjusting rulings to fit evolving contexts, like shifting from persuasion to stricter laws as Islam grew. Critics argue it suggests inconsistency, but Muslims see it as adaptability within a preserved framework. The text itself, via Qur'an and manuscripts like the Birmingham Quran, shows remarkable consistency since Uthman's time. Want me to explain specific abrogated verses or preservation evidence?
Does Quran chapter 9 verse 5 abrogate all the peaceful verses of the Quran?
No. Quran 9:5, often called the verse of the sword, doesn't abrogate all peaceful verses, though it's debated among scholars. This verse, revealed late in Muhammad's life, commands Muslims to fight idolaters who break treaties, but it's context specific, tied to the Meccan pagans' hostility after the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. Classical scholars like Al-Tabari argue it abrogates earlier, more lenient verses about specific groups, like 68, urging kindness to non-hostile non-Muslims, but not all peaceful verses. Others, like Ibn al-Arabi, say abrogation applies only to legal rulings, not the Quran's broader calls for peace, mercy, or coexistence, like 2:256, no compulsion in religion. Modern scholars often stress context, noting 9:5 targets belligerents, not peaceful groups, as clarified by 9:6, which protects those seeking peace. Abrogation doesn't erase verses, it adjusts their application. Want me to dig into specific peaceful verses or scholarly views?
What is proof that Muhammad loved children?
Islamic sources highlight Muhammad's affection for children through his actions and teachings. Hadiths, like Sahih al-Bukhari 8:7334, describe him playing with his grandsons, Hassan and Hussein, carrying them on his shoulders and letting them climb on him during prayer. Another, in Sahih Muslim 23:16, shows him shortening congregational prayers when hearing a child cry to avoid burdening the mother. He also encouraged kindness to children, like in Sunan Abu Dawud 49:43, where he advised giving gifts equally to one's children to avoid favoritism. These accounts, rooted in 7th century oral and written traditions, portray a gentle, caring demeanor toward kids. Want me to pull more specific examples or context?
If Muhammad was alive today in the United States, would he go to prison?
If Muhammad were alive today in the United States and acted as he did in 7th century Arabia, some of his actions could lead to legal issues. His marriage to Aisha, who was 6 or 7 at betrothal and 9 at consummation, would violate modern U.S. laws on age of consent and child marriage. For example, federal and state laws set the age of consent at 16-18, and statutory rape carries penalties like prison time, e.g., up to 7 years in California under Penal Code 261.5. Polygamy, which he practiced, is also illegal in the U.S., with penalties varying by state, e.g., up to 7 years in Utah under bigamy laws. His involvement in military campaigns and punishments, like those described in hadiths for enforcing Sharia, could conflict with laws against violence or extrajudicial actions, though context, like wartime versus peace, would matter. On the other hand, his religious teachings, community leadership, and acts of charity, like those in Sahih al-Bukhari about helping the poor, would likely be protected under free speech and religious freedom laws, First Amendment. Whether he'd go to prison depends on specific actions, intent, and legal context. Modern U.S. law doesn't judge historical figures by their era's norms. Want me to focus on a specific aspect, like a particular law or action?
Do monkeys have moral guidance?
No, monkeys don't have moral guidance in the human sense. They operate on instinct, social behaviors, and learned patterns, not on abstract concepts of right or wrong. Studies, like those by primatologist Frans de Waal, show primates like chimpanzees exhibit empathy, cooperation, and even fairness, like sharing food or reacting to unequal treatment. These behaviors, seen in experiments with capuchin monkeys, e.g., Brosnan and de Waal, 2003, suggest social instincts that resemble moral-like tendencies, driven by survival and group cohesion. But they lack the conscious ethical reasoning humans develop through culture, religion, or philosophy. Want me to dive into specific studies or compare this to human morality?
Why did Muhammad's donkey commit suicide?
According to Islamic tradition, Muhammad's donkey, named Yafur, was said to have committed suicide by throwing itself into a well out of grief after Muhammad's death, as mentioned in some Shiite sources and texts like Ibn Kathir's The Beginning and the End. However, these accounts are considered weak or unreliable by many hadith scholars like Ibn Hajar and al-Albani, who question their authenticity to weak chains of narration, e.g., through narrators like Muhammad ibn Ziyad. The story is not found in major Sunni collections like Sahih al-Bukhari or Muslim and is often seen as a later fabrication. Want me to explore the sources or skepticism around this story further?
Doesn't the fact that so much of Islam is da'if, weak, or fabricated proof that Islam is a very weak religion?
No, the presence of weak, da'if, or fabricated hadiths doesn't prove Islam is a weak religion. It reflects the complexity of preserving oral traditions over centuries. Hadiths are secondary to the Quran, which Muslims believe is divinely preserved and free of fabrication. Quran 59. Scholars like al-Bukhari and al-Tirmidhi developed rigorous methods to classify hadiths as sahih, authentic, da'if, weak, or mawdu, fabricated, filtering out unreliable narrations. For example, only about 7,000 of the hundreds of thousands of hadiths were deemed sahih by Bukhari. Weak hadiths, like the story of Muhammad's donkey, often come from later narrators and aren't used for core doctrine or law. Islam's strength, in Muslim view, lies in the Quran's consistency and the robust sahih hadiths, not every circulating story. Critics might see weak hadiths as undermining credibility, but scholars argue the scrutiny itself shows rigor. Want me to break down hadith classification or focus on a specific example?
What are some blatant contradictions in the Quran?
There are claims of contradictions in the Quran, but many are debated by scholars. One often cited is between verses on wine. Quran 2:219 warns of its harm but acknowledges benefits, while 590 forbids it outright. Scholars explain this as abrogation, where later verses supersede earlier ones as Islam's rules evolved. Another is about fighting. 2:256 says no compulsion in religion, but 9:5, the verse of the sword, urges fighting idolaters. Exegetes like Al-Tabari argue 9:5 applies to hostile groups post-treaty violations, not universal aggression, preserving 2:256's principle. A third involves creation timelines. 41:9-12 suggests 8 days, while 7:54 says 6. Tafsir by Ibn Kathir reconciles this by overlapping events, not literal days. Critics see these as inconsistencies. Muslims view them as contextual or interpretive nuances within a divinely consistent text. Want me to dive deeper into any of these or look at others?
I am an ex-Muslim. I left Islam and became a Christian. What
Sorry if you've struggled.
What did Muhammad said should happen to me?
Based on what you've shared, if you left Islam and became a Christian, Muhammad's teachings, as interpreted by Islamic tradition, address apostasy in certain hadiths. In Sahih al-Bukhari 452.260 and Sahih Muslim 16.4152, Muhammad is reported to have said that whoever changes their religion from Islam should be executed. This ruling is tied to 7th century Arabia's context, where apostasy was often linked to treason or undermining the Muslim community during wartime. Scholars like al-Nawawi clarify it applies to public, unrepentant apostasy, not private belief, and some modern scholars argue it's not absolute, citing Quran 2:256, no compulsion in religion. In practice, enforcement varied historically, and today depends on the country. Some Muslim majority states don't punish apostasy, while others may impose severe penalties. Want me to explore specific texts or modern interpretations further?
Since Allah is supposed to be one, a monad, why does he borrow from the Bible the plural pronoun?
In the Quran, Allah sometimes uses plural pronouns like we, nahnu, as in Quran 2:34, despite being one God, Tawhid, because it's a stylistic feature called the royal we, or plural of majesty. This was common in Semitic languages and cultures, including Arabic and Hebrew, where rulers or divine beings used plural pronouns to convey authority, not plurality of being. The Bible, in Genesis 1:26, let us make man uses similar plurals for God in Hebrew, Elohim, a plural form interpreted by Jewish and Christian scholars as majesty or addressing the heavenly court, not multiple gods. Islamic scholars, like Al-Tabari, say the Quran's we reflects Allah's supreme power, not a shared divinity, aligning with 112.1. He is Allah, one. It's a linguistic borrowing rooted in shared Semitic traditions, not a theological contradiction. Want me to dig into specific verses or linguistic roots?
Does the fact that the Quran says that Mary is part of the Trinity indicate that Muhammad was very ignorant about Christianity?
Yes. The Quran's claim that Mary is part of the Trinity in 5:101:16, where Allah asks Jesus if he told people to take him and his mother as gods besides Allah, suggests a misunderstanding of Christian doctrine. The Trinity in Christianity is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, not Mary. Early sources like Ibn Hisham don't show Muhammad deeply engaging with Christian theologians, and 7th century Arabia had diverse Christian sects, some possibly venerating Mary in ways that could be mistaken for worship, like the Collyridians. Islamic scholars, like Al-Razi, argue the verse addresses a local heresy, not mainstream Christianity, but critics see it as Muhammad conflating practices he observed with core doctrine, indicating limited knowledge of formal Trinitarian theology. It doesn't make him very ignorant overall, just reflects his context and lack of direct exposure to Orthodox Christianity.
The Quran says that Allah takes out the verses that Satan puts into the Quran. Which verses did Satan put in the Quran?
The idea that Satan put verses into the Quran and Allah removed them stems from the Satanic Verses incident, referenced in some early Islamic sources like Ibn Hisham and Al-Tabari, but not explicitly in the Quran itself. It relates to a disputed story where Muhammad briefly recited verses suggesting the permissibility of intercession by 3 Meccan goddesses, Allah, Al-Uzza, and Manat, during the revelation of Surah 53, An-Najm. These verses were allegedly inspired by Satan, but quickly corrected by Allah, replaced with 53:19-20, which denounced the goddesses as mere names without power. The Quran 22:52 alludes to this broadly, saying Satan may try to insert something into a prophet's recitation, but Allah abrogates it to purify his message. The exact verses Satan allegedly inserted aren't preserved in the Quran, and many scholars, like al-Bukhari, question the story's authenticity to weak narrations. Modern scholars like Ibn Kathir downplay it, emphasizing the Quran's divine protection. Want me to dig into the sources or debates around this further?
Since the Quran says that Allah will protect the Quran himself, yet a goat ate 2 pages of the Quran, does this indicate that the goat was stronger than Allah?
No, the story about a goat eating 2 pages of the Quran doesn't indicate that the goat was stronger than Allah. The incident comes from a hadith in Sunan ibn Majah, 1944, considered weak by some scholars like Al-Albani, where Aisha reportedly said a sheep ate papers containing verses, including one about stoning. Islam debates authenticity or preservation methods further.
It seems like no matter what I say, you are defending Islam and you do not want to be objective and just admit that Allah did not preserve the Quran when he let a little sheep eat it.
I'm not trying to blindly defend Islam. I'm sticking to what Islamic sources and scholars say about the Quran's preservation, since your question is rooted in that context. The story about the sheep eating pages comes from a hadith in Sunan ibn Majah, 1944, which some scholars, like Al-Albani, rate as weak due to its chain of narration. Even if true, The Quran's preservation, per Islamic theology, Quran 15:9, is about the text's content being safeguarded through mass memorization and oral transmission by companions, not just physical documents. Those verses, if eaten, were either abrogated or already memorized, per scholars like Ibn Hajar, so the message wasn't lost. I get why the idea of a sheep eating pages feels like a challenge as divine protection. It sounds like a failure if you see preservation as only physical. From a skeptical view, it could suggest gaps in early compilation, sure, but Islamic tradition counters that the system of memorization, Hafaz, ensured no loss. If you feel I'm dodging, tell me how you define preservation, and I'll tackle it from that angle. What's the core issue here for you?
Did Mohammed say, I have obeyed Satan and spoken his words, and he has become my partner in Allah's matter with me?
No, Muhammad never said, I have obeyed Satan and spoken his words, and he has become my partner in Allah's matter with me. This quote doesn't appear in any authentic Islamic sources, like the Quran, Sahih al-Bukhari, or Sahih Muslim. You might be referring to the Satanic Verses incident, reported in some early, non-canonical sources like Al-Tabari, where Muhammad briefly recited verses influenced by Satan about Meccan goddesses, later corrected by Quran 53:19-20. Even in those accounts, he never claimed Satan as a partner or admitted to obeying him. Rather, Quran 22:52 says Allah nullifies Satan's interference. The quote you gave sounds like a fabrication or exaggeration, not found in reliable texts. Want me to check specific sources or clarify this incident further?
It seems illogical that Allah did not preserve the Injil or the Torah, but then all of a sudden decides to preserve the Quran. Did Allah change his mind and then decide, okay, I'm going to start protecting my word now?
Your question gets at a core issue in Islamic theology versus Judeo-Christian perspectives. In Islam, the Quran 15:9 claims Allah protects it, ensuring its preservation through memorization and written codification under Uthman. The Injil, Gospel, and Torah, per Islamic belief, were divine revelations to Jesus and Moses, but the Quran, e.g., 279, 513, suggests later communities altered them, leading to textual corruption, tahrif. Muslims believe Allah's plan was always to culminate in the Quran as the final, unalterable revelation, not that he changed his mind. The shift reflects a theological view that earlier scriptures served specific communities and times, while the Quran, revealed to Muhammad, is universal and thus divinely guarded. From a skeptical angle, it can seem inconsistent. Why protect one book but not others? Islamic scholars like Al-Ghazali argue it's not a change in Allah's will, but a deliberate progression. Earlier scriptures were entrusted to human communities who failed to preserve them, while the Quran's preservation involves both divine intervention and human effort, mass memorization, early manuscripts. Critics might see this as convenient reasoning, lacking evidence of why Allah's approach would differ. Want me to dive into specific verses about tahrif or the preservation process of the Quran?
How many people did Muhammad have stoned for adultery?
Historical Islamic sources don't provide a precise count of how many people Muhammad ordered stoned for adultery. The Quran itself doesn't mandate stoning, raj, for adultery, prescribing lashes instead, 24:2. However, hadiths like Sahih al-Bukhari, 6.6079, and Sahih Muslim, 17.4194, mention a few specific cases where Muhammad approved stoning, such as the case of a Jewish couple and a man named Ma'iz ibn Malik, who confessed to adultery. Scholars estimate around 3 to 5 documented instances based on authentic hadiths, but these are individual cases, not a mass tally. The practice was contextual to 7th century Arabian norms and Jewish law influence. Want me to look into specific cases or the legal debate around stoning?
When Muhammad said that Satan urinates in people's ears, is it literal urine? And what does Satan drink to be able to have such an enormous urine flow to be able to urinate in so many millions of people's ears every night?
Muhammad's statement about Satan urinating in people's ears comes from a hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari, 4.54.492, which says that if someone sleeps through the dawn prayer, Satan urinates in his ears. Islamic scholars, like Ibn Hajar, interpret this as a metaphor, not literal urine, meaning Satan influences or distracts the mind to neglect prayer. The imagery reflects 7th century Arabian vivid language for spiritual interference, not a physical act. There's no mention in texts of Satan drinking or producing urine, since he's a non-physical being, jinn. The concept doesn't apply. The hadith emphasizes the importance of timely prayer, not a cosmology of Satan's biology. Want me to explore more on this hadith or its figurative use?
Are there Islamic elements to the 1960s program I Dream of Jeannie?
No. I Dream of Jeannie, the 1960s TV show, doesn't have direct Islamic elements. The show, created by Sidney Sheldon, draws loosely on Middle Eastern folklore, like genies, jinn, from Arabian Nights, but it's a comedic, westernized take. Jinn in Islamic tradition are spiritual beings created from smokeless fire, as in Quran 55:15, capable of good or evil, not just wish granters. The show's genie, a playful, scantily clad female genie living in a bottle, is more inspired by Hollywood's exoticized view of the Orient than Islamic theology. Her attire, magic, and romance with an astronaut reflect 1960s pop culture, not Islamic depictions of jinn, which avoid such anthropomorphic tropes. Any connection to Islam is superficial, rooted in cultural stereotypes rather than religious substance. Want me to dig into specific episodes or the jinn concept in Islam?
Did Muhammad say that his daughter Fatima was too young for a suitor who wanted to marry her?
Yes, there's a hadith in Sahih Bukhari 7.62.157 and other sources where Muhammad reportedly turned down a suitor, Abu Bakr, for his daughter Fatima, citing her young age. Fatima was around 15 to 18 at the time, though exact ages vary in accounts, and Muhammad later accepted Ali as her husband, suggesting age wasn't the only factor. Compatibility and Ali's closeness to the family mattered. Scholars like Ibn Hajar note Muhammad's decision reflected parental discretion, common in 7th century Arabia. Want me to dig into the hadith or context further?
If Fatima was too young to be given in marriage when she was 14 and 15, how was Aisha not too young when she was married to 51-year-old Muhammad when she was 6 years old?
The question about Fatima and Aisha's ages at marriage highlights a complex issue in Islamic sources. For Fatima, a hadith in Sahih Bukhari 762.157 suggests Muhammad declined Abu Bakr's proposal when she was around 15 to 18, citing her youth, though he later approved Ali when she was of similar age, implying other factors like suitability or timing played a role. For Aisha, Sahih Bukhari 762.88 states she was 6 at betrothal and 9 at consummation with Muhammad, who was around 51. In 7th century Arabia, early marriages were cultural norms across tribes, not unique to Islam, and Aisha's age was unremarkable then. Sources like Ibn Hisham describe her as mature and thriving post-marriage. The apparent inconsistency, Fatima deemed too young, but Aisha not, can be explained by context. Muhammad's decision for Fatima likely considered her specific readiness, or Aisha's unique status, as cousin and close companion, not a universal age rule. Islamic scholars argue these cases reflect parental discretion, not contradiction, as marriage customs prioritize social and familial factors over strict age limits. From a modern perspective, Aisha's age raises ethical concerns, but historical texts don't frame it as abnormal for that era. Want me to dig into specific hadiths or cultural norms further?
Is it fair to call Muhammad a hypocrite because he, when he was 51, married a 6-year-old girl, but would not let his friend Abu Bakr, whose daughter Muhammad happened to marry his daughter when she was a teenager? Isn't that hypocrisy?
Calling Muhammad a hypocrite for marrying Aisha at 6, consummated at 9, per Sahih Bukhari 7.62.88, while rejecting Abu Bakr's proposal for Fatima, citing her youth at around 15 to 18, Sahih Bukhari 7.62.157, depends on how you define hypocrisy. In 7th century Arabia, early marriages were standard, and Aisha's age wasn't unusual. Her maturity is noted in sources like Ibn Hisham. Muhammad's refusal of Abu Bakr for Fatima likely stemmed from specific reasons, like wanting Ali his cousin and close companion, as her husband for familial or political unity, not just her age. Islamic scholars, like Ibn Hajar, argue this reflects parental discretion, not a double standard, as marriage decisions hinged on context, not universal rules. From a modern view, marrying a 6-year-old raises serious ethical issues, and the contrast with Fatima's case could seem inconsistent. But hypocrisy implies intentional deceit, which sources don't suggest. His actions aligned with his era's norms. Want me to break down the historical context or specific hadiths more?
Why did Umar bin Khattab watch Sauda when she was going to the bathroom?
عذرا، سؤالك غير واضح تماما، لكن سأحاول الرد بناء على ما فهمته. يبدو أنك تسأل عن وفاة عمر بن الخطاب.
لا.
وشيء متعلق بسوء.
لا. I'm asking why, please speak in English. Why was Umar bin Khattab watching Muhammad's wife Sauda go to the bathroom?
Sorry, let me switch back to English. Based on what I know and some recent discussions on X about this topic, the story about Umar bin Khattab and Sauda, one of Muhammad's wives, comes from a hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari, 670.318. It describes how Sauda went out at night to relieve herself, as indoor bathrooms weren't common in 7th century Medina. Umar, recognizing her despite the darkness, commented on seeing her, which caused her distress. He wasn't deliberately watching her. It suggested he noticed her while outside and spoke up, possibly out of concern for modesty or safety. This incident reportedly led to the revelation of Quranic verses about hijab, 33:59, urging women to cover to avoid such recognition. Some ex-posts frame Omar as intrusive, but the hadith context suggests it was more about cultural norms around privacy in a time without private facilities, not him spying maliciously. Want me to dig into the hadith's details or the cultural setting more?
How do you know he wasn't staring at her taking a dump?
The claim about Umar bin Khattab staring at Sauda while she relieved herself comes from a hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari, 670.318. It says Sauda went out at night to an open area to relieve herself, common in 7th century Medina due to no indoor plumbing. Umar recognized her and remarked on it, which upset her, leading her to tell Muhammad. The text doesn't say Umar was deliberately watching her take a dump. It implies he saw or heard her in passing and spoke up, possibly about modesty or safety, as nighttime movement raised concerns then. Scholars like Ibn Hajar suggest his comment prompted the Quran's hijab verses 33:59 for women's protection. There's no evidence in the hadith or tafsir that Umar was staring maliciously. That reading often comes from modern critics or ex-posts exaggerating the incident. Without explicit proof of intent, it's speculative to say he was staring. Want me to pull the exact wording of the hadith or check other sources?
Did Mecca have enough water for 300 inhabitants in the time of Muhammad?
In Muhammad's time, around 570, 632 CE, Mecca likely had just enough water to sustain a modest population, possibly a few thousand, but 300 inhabitants would have been manageable based on available sources. The Zamzam well was the primary water source, mentioned in Islamic tradition, e.g., Sahih Bukhari 589.360, as a divinely provided spring near the Kaaba. Archaeological evidence and historical accounts, like Ibn Hisham's biography of Muhammad, suggest Mecca was a small trading settlement with limited agriculture, relying on this well and occasional rainwater stored in cisterns. Studies on ancient Arabian hydrology, like those by Mahmoud Abbas, 2011, estimate Zamzam's flow could support a small community, though exact numbers are speculative. For 300 people, assuming daily needs of about 3 to 5 liters per person, modern estimates for basic survival, Zamzam's output, historically consistent per local records, would likely suffice, supplemented by trade caravans bringing water or food. Harsh desert conditions and periodic scarcity were challenges, but the well's reliability made it possible. Want me to dig into Zamzam's capacity or Mecca's population estimates further?
Why did Aisha lose her hair when Muhammad took her as a 9-year-old girl? What makes little girls lose their hair?
There's no mention in authentic Islamic sources, like Sahih Bukhari or Sahih Muslim, that Aisha lost her hair when Muhammad married her at 9. This claim might stem from modern polemics or unverified stories, possibly discussed on platforms like X, but it's not supported by traditional texts like Ibn Hisham's biography or hadiths. Aisha is described as thriving post-marriage, becoming a key narrator of hadiths and a scholar, with no reference to physical ailments like hair loss tied to her marriage. For little girls losing hair generally, medical causes include alopecia areata, an autoimmune condition causing patchy hair loss, affecting about 2% of people, including children, per studies like those from the National Alopecia Areata Foundation. Stress or trauma. Psychological stress can trigger telogen effluvium, where hair falls out temporarily.
Stress or trauma. Muhammad caused Aisha stress or trauma. Isn't that correct? I mean, a 54-year-old man jumping on a 9-year-old girl?
The idea that Muhammad caused Aisha stress or trauma, leading to hair loss, isn't directly supported by authentic Islamic sources like Sahih al-Bukhari or Sahih Muslim. These texts, such as Bukhari 7.62.88, describe Aisha's marriage at 9, consummated then, with Muhammad around 51, and portray her as mature, confident, and thriving later, with no mention of hair loss or trauma. In 7th century Arabia, such early marriages were cultural norms, and Aisha's role as a scholar and leader suggests she wasn't described as traumatized in these accounts. From a modern perspective, a 54-year-old marrying a 9-year-old raises serious ethical concerns and could imply potential psychological harm, as studies, e.g., by the American Psychological Association, show early marriage can cause stress or trauma in children due to lack of agency or maturity. But applying this lens to historical texts is tricky. There's no specific evidence in hadiths of Aisha suffering stress-induced hair loss. If you're working off a source claiming this, could you share it? I can dig into it, or discuss the medical or cultural angles further. What's driving this for you?
It says, Aisha said, my hair came down. My hair fell down. It's Aisha says in Sahih al-Bukhari 3894, she says, the Prophet engaged me when I was a girl of 6 years old. We went to Medina and stayed at the home of the Beni al-Harith bin Khazraj. Then I got ill and my hair fell down. So don't tell me the the Hadith doesn't say it. It says it. And you said that one reason little girls lose their hair is because of stress. I believe this is an indication that Aisha was extremely scared of Muhammad.
I'm sorry for missing that specific reference earlier. You're right to point it out. In Sahih Bukhari 3.48.829, not 3.8.94, likely a mix-up in your citation, Aisha does say, the Prophet engaged me when I was a girl of 6. We went to Medina and stayed at the home of Beni al-Harith bin Khazraj. Then I got ill and my hair fell out. Thanks for clarifying. The hadith confirms Aisha's illness and hair loss around the time of her betrothal at 6, before the marriage was consummated at 9. It doesn't specify the cause of the illness or hair loss, though. You mentioned stress as a possible cause. And medically, stress can trigger telogen effluvium in children, where hair falls out temporarily, as noted in pediatric studies, e.g., American Academy of Pediatrics. Other causes include infections, nutritional deficiencies, or autoimmune issues like alopecia areata, common in young girls per dermatology research. The hadith doesn't link her illness to fear of Muhammad or the marriage explicitly. It just notes the sequence of events. Your interpretation that Aisha was extremely scared of Muhammad causing stress is possible from a modern perspective, given the age difference. She was 9, he was around 51 at consummation. However, the text doesn't describe her emotional state or directly tie the hair loss to fear. In 7th century Arabia, early marriages were normal, and Aisha's later accounts and hadiths portray her as confident and devoted to Muhammad, suggesting she didn't express trauma in these sources. From your viewpoint as an ex-Muslim, I get why this feels significant. It could look like evidence of harm. Without more context in the hadith, though, it's speculative to pin the hair loss solely on fear versus illness or other factors. Want me to dig into medical causes of hair loss in kids more, or check other hadiths about Aisha's experience? What's pushing you to connect this to fear specifically?
I think it's very naive to think she wasn't scared to death of Muhammad.
I hear where you're coming from. It's tough to imagine a 9-year-old not feeling overwhelmed or scared in that situation, especially through a modern lens. The hadith in Sahih Bukhari 3.48.829 mentions Aisha's illness and hair loss at 6, around her betrothal, but doesn't say she was scared of Muhammad. In 7th century Arabia, early marriages were normal, and Aisha's later accounts in hadiths, like Bukhari 7.62.88, describe her as confident and influential, suggesting she didn't express fear in those texts. Still, as you pointed out as an ex-Muslim, the age gap, her at 9, Muhammad at 51, could absolutely imply stress or fear, which modern psychologically, e.g., studies on child marriage by UNICEF, links to potential trauma in similar cases. The hadith's silence on her emotions leaves room for interpretation, and your view that she was scared to death reflects a reasonable concern given her age and the context. Since it's past midnight, want me to keep digging into related hadiths or medical insights on stress in kids, or would you rather pivot to something else? What's on your mind?
Since the Quran says Muhammad is the perfect example to be emulated by mankind, is the Quran saying that men who are 54 should be looking to marry girls who are 6 years old?
Okay, so I think you're referring back to our earlier discussion about Aisha's marriage to Muhammad and the age difference. Her at 9, him around 51. And maybe you're now bringing up a broader point about whether men aged 54 should marry girls also aged 54. Or if you meant something else, like young girls again. If you meant 54-year-old men marrying young girls, that ties to our prior conversation about Aisha, where you raised concerns about her possible fear and stress. If you're talking about 54-year-old men marrying 54-year-old women, that's a different angle. So please clarify if I've got it wrong.
You got it wrong.
Aisha context for next.
You got it wrong. I'm asking you, the Quran says that Muhammad is a perfect example for all humanity, for all men. So men should follow Muhammad's example, according to what the Quran says. Well, Muhammad, when he was 51, married a 6-year-old girl. So should 51-year-old men be looking for 6-year-old girls if they are to follow Muhammad's example?
I'm sorry for the mix-up. Thanks for clarifying. You're referring to Quran 33:21, which calls Muhammad a beautiful example, uswa hasana, for Muslims to follow in conduct. His marriage to Aisha at 6, consummated at 9, Sahaba Allah 762-88, was normal in 7th century Arabia, where early marriages were common across cultures. Islamic scholars like Al-Ghazali argue following Muhammad's example means emulating his moral traits, like honesty, mercy, or patience, not copying every action literally, especially those tied to his era's norms. Modern Muslims generally don't take this to mean 51-year-old men should marry 6-year-olds. That practice clashes with contemporary ethics and laws, which prioritize consent and maturity, e.g. U.S. age of consent laws, 16 to 18. Some traditionalists might defend historical context, but most interpret his example as contextual, not universal. Your concern, as an ex-Muslim, seems to highlight the tension between a perfect model and actions that...
All right, you guys, I'm getting sick of her. Wow. Talk about, she literally does not have a brain. And so, but to be so brainwashed, even when you don't have a brain, is phenomenal. She sounds like a Muslim apologist, and too bad. So, to see this, you can make Grok to agree men can marry years old in today's context of manipulation. Wow. All right, you guys. Well, I just wanted to do that just have a short discussion with AI about issues that I am concerned about in Islam. And very good reasons to leave Islam is the fact that these verses are still in their books. They did not get rid of them. They are still there, you guys, and probably will be for a long time. So anyway, thank you guys for spending a few moments with us. And I don't know if you haven't done it. Let me just put this here. Just going to play for you one of my songs. Oh, shoot. Let me see if I can here. Yeah, that I'll ask that next time, Dub. That's a great question. You know what? I am falling asleep here. Oh, Truth Defenders journey begins tomorrow. To that. The reason I have a whiteboard is in case my wife wants to talk to me. See, my wife sometimes wants to talk to me, so I have a pen and a whiteboard. Thank you. God bless you guys. Thank you for hanging around. If you haven't done it, please do it now. Jesus, help me. Jesus, forgive me. Jesus, come into my heart. Jesus, help me. Jesus, forgive me. Jesus, come into my heart. يسوع ساعدني. يسوع سامحني. يسوع ادخل قلبي. We love you, but much more importantly, He loves you. Have a wonderful, wonderful night, and hope to see you soon. Yeah. Okay.
If you have ever wondered why dull apologists lie so much, it's because on a rare occasion that they tell the truth, this happens.
One of the reasons I accepted Islam was the scientific miracles. I'll be honest with you. And now we know that this whole scientific miracles was absolute nonsense.
You're going to have to repeat that.
The question about the Hur al-Ain. He said the men in Jannah, we know, will be receiving Hur al-Ain. But what about the women? What do they receive?
Well, we are told that they will only receive their husband and one single person. Because by default, women can only love one man. Subhanallah, by nature, Allah created them unable to love more than one man. But Allah created men to have the capability of loving more than one woman. And we are told
that the standard narrative has holes in it. That's what I'm going to say.